Hey guys, this is Quentin from Champion Briefs. Today we're going to be talking about the January 2025 public forum topic about recognition of Somaliland. We're going to talk about the resolution itself, kind of what it means before diving into some general thoughts and things to be aware of when developing your strategy for debating this topic. And then we're going to look at some specific arguments on both sides. Now, the resolution, word by word, is resolved the African Union should grant diplomatic recognition to the Republic of Somaliland as an independent state. The first term that pops out is the African Union. If you're unfamiliar, the African Union is much like the United Nations, an international governing institution. The United Nations works on a global level, while the African Union works on a continental level. You guessed it, it's Africa. They are the actor in the resolution, so the affirmative world only has them do something, which in this instance is granting diplomatic recognition. Now, what does that mean? Diplomatic recognition is just what it sounds like. It's a political act that simply acknowledges the existence of a state or its government. So in this resolution, we're talking about the Republic of Somaliland, which from here on we're just going to call Somaliland. So it would be the African Union acknowledging the existence of Somaliland and its government. Now, Somaliland has some history to it. Right now, it's an unrecognized independent state within Northern Africa, specifically the Horn of Africa. Now, hundreds of years ago, this area was kind of developing with a handful of different kingdoms sort of staking their claim until 1960. In 1960, the United Kingdom granted the state of Somaliland independence as their own state, but pretty immediately, like within 5 days or so, they turned around and Somaliland voluntarily joined Somalia in order to form the Somali Republic. Now, this created some immediate issues that evolved and morphed into what was a 10-year war that ended in 1991. At the conclusion of this war, Somaliland declared their own independence from Somalia. Now, this independence has been ignored by nearly everybody, going totally unrecognized, at least by the United Nations member states. The United Nations member states are a pretty big marker for international recognition because in the international arena, those are the ones that matter. So being unrecognized by any United Nations member states has put Somaliland in a pretty bad spot. Now, let's look at some general thoughts, and what I mean is things to be aware of when talking about this topic. There's two main ones. The first is that very few arguments on this topic are only accessible by one side, whether that's AF or neg. So arguments stemming from or relating to the economy or regional conflict in some form are going to exist on both AF and neg. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. It creates interesting debates, I think, and creates a lot of clash, which is kind of the point of public forum topics. They are supposed to be kind of who gets the argument, who wins this impact. So I think it'll be fun, but it's something to be aware of. Now, the second thing to be aware of is that, of course, there's lots of history to the continent of Africa, and especially this region we're talking about, Northern Africa. Obviously, this isn't surprising. It's a massive continent, tons of countries, tons of history. Of course, there's a lot to take note of. But I only make note of this because most of us debating this topic are not from Africa, are probably less aware of the history of Africa than maybe we should be, and especially when most of the topics that we debate are in some form related to the United States doing something, and we're pretty aware of the United States history and what the impacts would be, we're less aware of African history. So what this means is that every claim that you're going to make in the debate round about something happening or not happening as a result of affirming or negating the resolution probably has some empirical or historical evidence that either supports it or opposes it. For example, anything stemming from the African Union. The African Union as an institution has decided or refused to do a lot of things in its history. So you need to be prepared to prove and defend why the African Union recognition of Somaliland or lack of recognition would cause something to happen different from every other decision that they've made. If you're going to make some argument about them, recognizing or not recognizing causes them to ignore this other issue, you've got to be able to prove why Somaliland is uniquely key, why it's not just a matter of them ignoring it, because, like I said, they make so many decisions every day. You've got to be able to prove why this one is key. Now, another argument kind of to consider in this light is that many states have seceded from their countries, sometimes successfully, other times not so much, both in the history of Africa and the whole world. If you're going to make an argument about secession itself, or follow-on secession from other countries, which we're going to talk about later, there have been so many secessions in history that you've got to be able to be, or you've got to be at least willing to debate about why the secessionist movements you're talking about are unique and different from these other ones that we've seen throughout history for as long as humans have been around. And then Somaliland specifically, like we said, it's gone through a lot of history, and in 1991, Somaliland declared its own, independence. So it's existed in its current form for over 30 years. So if you're talking about impacts about its independence being recognized, you've got to be able to explain why your impacts happen now if they didn't 5, 10, 15 years ago. That's just a matter of Somaliland being in limbo for so long, empirics kind of work against you in a way. You've got to be able to prove time frame now being key to whatever argument you're making. So overall, the conclusion of this is that there are two things to note. The first is that this is probably not a topic where you can just win off of having a good argument that the other side doesn't have. On some of these topics, we've all seen aff or neg. You always pref one side because you've got this one contention that you read that just goes, it's not beatable. This is not a topic like that, I don't think. I think both sides are usually going to be able to access similar impacts and similar arguments. So this topic is going to be one where you have to debate it out and prove why your side gets that argument or why the story that you're telling makes more sense than your opponent's. And you need to be careful with the arguments you make because it can be fairly easy to try and give examples of past events in order to support your argument and inadvertently make your argument non-unique due to the extensive history of the region. So on that point, just again, be prepared to explain and argue the nuance of what you're talking about happening versus history. Now let's look at the affirmative or the pro side. We're going to talk about a couple arguments here. The first being that Somaliland recognition grants them international legitimacy. International legitimacy is a pretty important point for them being able to access resources and things like international support for a slew of different things. For example, institutions of democracy to strengthen their own governance system. This international legitimacy would give them the avenues to strengthen their democratic institutions, to therefore strengthen their governance system, which would theoretically solve a lot of the impacts and a lot of the conflict that we're seeing. Similarly, international legitimacy would give them access to aid and assistance that is separate from or maybe in addition to the United Nations missions that have been active in the area for a long time. Maybe that new aid and assistance could be the make or break for their success and stability as a region. Impacts of this kind about legitimacy can lead to or be kind of whatever you want. If you've been debating long at all, you're pretty familiar with democracy as an impact. it's kind of a tree that branches out into just about anything. It can be war, it can be economics, it can be human rights. We'll talk about an avenue later that you can use, but generally, if you want to access a pretty broad impact through democracy, this international legitimacy point is a pretty strong one to get there as kind of a baseline foundational argument for recognition being good. Now, the next argument would be something about conflict, either proxy warfare or counterterrorism. Broadly, this is a regional stability argument. Now, the idea is that lots of conflict is currently stemming from Somaliland being unrecognized, which causes regional instability in the Horn of Africa or Northern Africa in a lot of different ways, but two main ones are what we're going to talk about. The first one is proxy warfare. There are currently major tensions between Egypt and Ethiopia that are coming to a head in this region, in Somalia and Somaliland. If this is the argument you want to make, the impact being warfare, and warfare like this, like in any form, is a pretty compelling impact, on its own, but it can even be extended out and expanded to be used as like an internal link to a major power draw-in, like US and China. Like the proxy warfare creates such an unstable region that the US and China feel like they have to step in, and then they develop their own kind of conflict and so on and so forth. In debate, we make it bigger than it is. That's how you do it there. Now, the second route is counterterrorism, specifically through the Al-Shabaab. Now, the Al-Shabaab is sort of an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, meaning it's a terrorist group that is responsible for a lot of violence in the region, sort of based out of their Somali nationalist and Islamist ideologies. With Al-Shabaab, a lot of their members of the terrorist organization are also parts of the clans that are throughout Somaliland. And the clans have a major portion of control in Somaliland for its governance because of the lack of a strong governance system. So what this means is that the democracy argument we were talking earlier can be used as an internal link to weakening the terrorist power. Because the clan-based system is so strong in part due to a lack of strong democratic governance. So helping expand and promote that democratic governance would then weaken the Al-Shabaab's control throughout the region. Similarly, through the international support and resources argument, you can also access things like military aid and counterterrorism support from the international community that would help respond to and fight against the Al-Shabaab's violence in the region. Impact-wise, regional stability and conflict, again, is a pretty good impact in and of itself, but it can also extend to global economy arguments, and larger instances of conflict through draw-in of other countries if you wanted to. Now, the third affirmative argument is Taiwan. This is really great if you enjoyed debating the November-December topic and you still want to access that literature base. The idea is that Somaliland recognition helps legitimize Taiwan, since those two states have strong ties to each other, and the fact that the African Union and the United Nations decisions are pretty related to each other. There is a solid spillover argument about the AU recognizing Somaliland, which leads to the United Nations recognizing Somaliland, and then the United Nations keeps that precedent in order to recognize Taiwan as kind of a domino effect. I think that's really fun, in debate these days. There's a way to access a Taiwan argument somewhere on every topic. It's kind of just where we're at with debate, and this is how you get there on this topic. I think it's pretty cool. Now let's look at negative. The first argument on the negative I want to talk about is spillover, or follow-on secessionism. The idea that granting independence or recognition of independence creates a spillover effect to other countries, causing a ripple of new secessionist movements. The idea is that if other secessionist movements in the region see Somaliland kind of work out, for lack of a better term, it will encourage them to also secede, thinking it will work for them too. Now, the thing about secessionists and secessionism is that fighting is inevitable whenever it occurs, because secession is inherently a violent thing. Whenever members or a region of a country want to separate from that country, the parent country will never typically allow that peacefully. Very rarely will they be cool with it without at least trying to gain control back. We're talking about a breakup here where there's lots of geopolitical power that comes with staying together. So whenever a secessionist movement develops and gains steam and tries to actually break away, conflict is inevitable from it. So that's, an impact in and of itself. But this is an instance where empirics could work for or against you, kind of like we were talking about before. Secession and civil war, like we said, is violent by default, which makes it a super easy argument to support with empirics if you just want to go for like localized conflict and regional instability. What I mean is that there are tons of instances of secessionist movements and civil wars and breakaway states, especially in the African region. But most of the evidence is going to have, support the idea of localized conflict. Lots of conflict, lots of violence, a lot of bad things, of course, but it's pretty localized to that region. So if you want to go for something bigger, like arguing that these follow-on or ripple effect secessionist movements would get out of control and form some sort of larger war, you will have kind of an uphill battle fighting against some historical evidence that says it stays pretty localized to the region, the secessionist state and the parent state. The same goes for the spillover argument broadly. Somaliland wouldn't be the first secessionist state to be recognized as an independent state. So you'll have to be prepared to explain why it uniquely would trigger more movements and civil wars. If there's been another country in the past that had a civil war and became an independent state, and then that state was recognized, why didn't that cause all of this spillover secessionist movements? You'll have to be able to prove why, again, this instance is unique. Now, the second argument is about reconciliation, and reconciliation being preferable. Reconciliation is the process by which Somalia and Somaliland reform as one, either just as Somalia as one large country, or with Somaliland still existing, but just as some form of state within Somalia, like a federalist system. This reconciliation would theoretically create stronger diplomacy, a stronger economy, which reduces poverty for its citizens. It would make for a better governance system, and it would be much less conflict because Somaliland and Somalia have a lot of conflict between them, which causes other conflict and so on and so forth. So it's a pretty strong argument that reconciliation is preferable for the region. But this comes with a huge flashing neon light warning with hazard signs and lots of exclamation points. We know counterplans are not allowed in public forum, right? Like, that's pretty clear. Anytime you even say anything sort of about something on negative, you're going to get told pretty quick that counterplans are not allowed. So we have to be pretty careful with how we describe alternatives like this. In this instance, the affirmative world, where Somaliland is independently recognized as a state, means that reconciliation cannot happen. Somaliland cannot both be independent and go back to being part of Somalia. So the way that you would argue this is that since reconciliation is possible in the status quo, it is an option now that a lot of people talk about, a lot of people support, but it's not an option in the affirmative world. The status quo through a negative ballot is preferable. To be clear, you are not arguing that a neg ballot is a vote for reconciliation, because that's pretty close to a counterplan. You can't say vote neg to vote for reconciliation, or that the neg world causes reconciliation, because again, that's a counterplan. But rather, you are saying that an AF ballot prevents reconciliation from ever occurring, since the affirmative world and reconciliation are mutually exclusive to each other. So voting negative for the status quo is better, to leave the door open for reconciliation, and reconciliation is preferable, and so on. The third argument to talk about is Egypt and Ethiopia. Egypt is pretty starkly against the recognition of Somaliland, so much so that it could trigger new violence that hasn't been seen yet. Due to Ethiopia's limited recognition of Somaliland in order to access ports for trade, if you're unfamiliar, Ethiopia and Somaliland signed a memorandum of understanding, which allows Ethiopia to sort of halfway, 1 foot in, 1 foot out, recognize Somaliland as a state without officially declaring it to trade for access to some of their ports. In response to this very limited recognition even, Egypt is threatening violence in response and is sending weaponry to Somalia, presumably to support Somalia in its conflict against Somaliland, hoping to reconcile and make them one state again. So same as before, you can access pretty standard impacts about war and conflict here, and you just have to decide how big you want to make that impact, whether it's localized or bigger. That's pretty much all I've got for arguments and topic analysis. Like I said, I think that it's a really interesting topic. I think it's a fun topic. I wish I was debating it. It's at the very least interesting. There's a couple of things to note. Again, a lot of the arguments that you hear are going to be the same on both sides. It's just going to be a different way to get to the argument or get to the impact. And again, be aware of the history of the region at the very least, the history of Africa as a continent. There is everything that you are debating and talking about now has occurred in some form in the region, most likely. And so you need to be aware of that so you can be able to explain why the argument you're making is unique and different. This month's Champion Briefs, the release for January, dives into all of this and more. With much more depth than I can have in an analysis video. The arguments I've talked about here are just a handful of the 30 or so arguments with supporting evidence that are in the brief. So if anything I've mentioned piqued your interest at all, the brief is definitely worth considering if you don't have it already. With all that being said, that concludes this topic analysis video for the January topic. I appreciate your time. I think it's a fun topic. Good luck and enjoy.